Hi, my name is Lisa Ruland, and I'm here to talk about sudden loss without a body.
Welcome to The Silent Why,
a podcast on a mission to explore 101 different types of loss, collecting stories of hope and chatting to those who've experienced each of them.
We're your hosts, Chris and Claire Sands.
And in this episode, we're chatting about the sudden and unexpected loss of a husband following a mountain climbing tragedy, which left the family without a body to say goodbye to, mourn over, or bury.
We don't know if it was because they got disoriented in a sudden snowstorm up there or what. We'll never know. At some point, there was a huge rock slide and avalanche. Within several hours, it changed over to recovery, the presumption of an acknowledgement that everyone is dead. And I found that out in the airport, about to go through the security line to fly out to Seattle.
Lisa Kolb Ruland is a former New York prosecutor, a graduate of the Culinary Institute of America's Baking and Pastry program, and now a food writer and editor of the website Unpeeled Journal, where she also writes about grief and loss. She splits her time between Brooklyn, New York and Washington, D.C.
Back in 2012, Lisa married Eric, a lover of the outdoors, but sadly less than 2 years after that, she waved him off on a 5-day mountain climbing trip up Mount Rainier near Seattle and never saw him again. While camping at almost 13,000 feet up, it's believed a storm caused an avalanche that swept all 6 members of his climbing group away, tragically resulting in their deaths.
3 bodies were later recovered from the national park site, but Eric's wasn't one of them. As the site of his death, to this day, the mountain continues to be a source of very mixed and complicated feelings for Lisa.
The way I feel about Mount Rainier is that it's both his grave and a monument, but it's also his murderer. So I have very mixed emotions about that mountain. I think that's why I've only been back once.
Through her grief, Lisa turned to writing and speaking about loss, with a special interest in the relationship between loss and food. So you might recognise her from Claire's Let's Chat Food and Grief episode back in December.
In this chat, Lisa talks about accepting a loved one is gone without any physical proof, and how the rituals that follow death play an important part that was missing for her. She also talks about the very personal things that she's done to try and have any part of Eric near her again.
I did this kind of forensic thing. I was plucking hair off his pillowcase and off his bath towel, because that's all I had. And I just put it in a little envelope and I wrote Eric on it.
Lisa's journey is such a source of inspiration as she moves from the horror of the mountain to the hope of a new life, a new direction, and a partnership with her also widowed husband, Brodie.
Give yourself the grace of being happy for yourself. When you are happy again, you deserve it. And I still remember the first time I had like a big laugh after Eric died, and it just felt so good and a little foreign, but so good. And then I think it gets more and more frequent, and that's all to the good.
We know you'll really value all Lisa has to say, and we started the conversation by asking her to introduce herself.
My name is Lisa Ruland. I'm a food writer, and I also write about grief and loss. I'm based in Washington, D.C. and Brooklyn, New York. I'm currently in Washington, D.C. recording this. I lost my husband suddenly when he was in a mountaineering accident in 2014. So today, as I record this in January 2023, I have remarried. I'm now a stepmother. I am still doing work in writing and food writing, and have, for obvious reasons, taken an additional interest in writing about grief and loss and exploring different elements of that. But doing well. And I just want to say thank you so much, inviting me on, covering this topic, but also just doing this entire podcast with such sensitivity and insight, and you're just doing it just so beautifully. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation today.
Us too, definitely. Thank you. We're coming up to a decade. You mentioned there that accident back in 2014. Does it feel like 10 years?
Oh, it's funny. I feel like, kind of like with the pandemic, time is just very elastic when it comes to this. In some ways, it feels like yesterday. In other ways, it feels like forever. And I think it's ever changing. Sometimes I feel like I still have these moments where it seems surreal, and I'll look around at my life and think, how am I doing this? How do I have this house and this husband and this family? But in other times, it just feels like a very natural progression over the years. And I think we've all learned somewhat in the past few years how very strange time can be and feel. And it's just not emotionally linear, I would say.
So tell us a little bit about Eric and how and when you met him.
I met Eric. We were both living in New York City, and we met in 2007 when he actually, we were both in our 20s. I was a young lawyer, actually, career changed from there, but I was a young attorney and had a couple roommates, and we were interviewing new roommates for our apartment in Brooklyn. And he's one of the people we interviewed to be a roommate. And it was funny because I liked him right from the beginning. So it was great because in the interview setting, I was able to ask questions right off the bat, like, do you have a girlfriend? And just kind of make it seem like it was part of the interview process for the apartment. But it was totally self-serving. He was so nice, and we just kind of clicked. And we did not offer him the room in the apartment, but I volunteered to be the one to email him and break the news. But I kind of threw in, but if you're still looking in the neighborhood and whatever, when I get together to chat about what it's like living in Park Slope neighborhood of Brooklyn, let me know. And so we just kind of started dating from there. He's very outdoorsy. I pretended to be for him somewhat. I'm not that I'm like not outdoorsy, but he was more extreme for sure. It was always a very nice antidote for him, I think, to kind of a white collar job in the city, to just be able to get out in nature and the wild and just kind of feel alive in that way. And we married in 2012, and then he was killed suddenly for a holiday weekend in May 2014. So we were only married about a year and a half at that point. He did a mountain climbing trip to summit Mount Rainier, which is in Washington State on the west coast of the US. And while he was on his mountain climb, he and the rest of the group, 6 people total, were all killed. And kind of so began, the life after that. I think I could divide it into before the accident and life after the accident.
Was that something he'd done before, that sort of climbing, or was this a new thing he was going into?
He had gotten more and more into it. One thing with outdoorsy people with an adventurous spirit, it's always kind of what's the next thing. And I don't think he saw this as, and I certainly didn't. I mean, you can see Mount Rainier from downtown Seattle. And I think that was one of the strange things to me. And I know one has nothing to do with the other, but there was to me some kind of cognitive dissonance in the fact that I could be standing in a major US city and look at a mountain that was so wild and dangerous it could kill people. It just kind of didn't make sense to me. I suppose I often thought about that in the Himalayas or some other distant place that was more dangerous. He had been working his way up in both skill level and challenge for a number of years, getting into ice climbing and more mountaineering. So he was certainly qualified for this climb. He was experienced enough for this climb. So it wasn't anything like that. He was with expert guides, and everyone else on the team also had a lot of experience. And they just found themselves, we don't know everything. There's only what the evidence shows. And what the evidence showed was that they ended up having to do what's called a bivy, short for bivouac, which means an emergency shelter. So they found themselves on one of the nights of the climb, not where they would typically want to be, and having to make emergency camp in what was in fact a very dangerous area of the mountain. And we don't know if it was because they got disoriented in a sudden snowstorm up there or what. We'll never know. But they were doing a bivy, and then at some point, they believed during the overnight hours, there was a huge rock slide and avalanche, and they were all kind of swept thousands of feet down the mountain into a crevasse, and they all were killed. And 3 bodies were recovered, 3 bodies were not. Eric was one of the bodies that was not recovered.
So when you first found out that something had happened, was it a case of your husband Eric is missing, and then there was a period of time before there was confirmation that his body was lost?
Yeah, at first it was deemed a rescue operation, And that's how I first heard about it. A representative from the family liaison from the Mount Rainier National Park, the Park Service, called and said that there had been an accident and they were doing a rescue operation. And at that point, I feel like everything kind of started blacking out. And I remember words. I remember, helicopters searching. I remember the words debris field, things like that. And I knew at that point I needed to get out there. I don't know at that point if the Park Service already knew what the inevitable result was and they were just trying to stage us along and kind of get us there. But in any event, they did tell us it was rescue. But within several hours, it changed over to recovery. And that's a completely different thing. That is the presumption of an acknowledgement that everyone is dead. And I found that out in the airport, about to go through the security line to fly out to Seattle.
Is that an airport that you have to go to quite regularly? Is that something that you have to kind of re-experience?
That's a very good question. It's one of the major airports of the New York City area, Newark International Airport. And I have actually avoided taking flights through Newark Airport ever since. And I think that's something that maybe I should get over. But if it's, $100 more to just fly out of JFK, I'm going to do JFK because I think it's just such a visceral memory. And I even struggle now to look at mountains and avoid going to mountains. And, I don't know about in England, but here they like to do these kind of rugged car commercials for pickup trucks and large SUVs. And a lot of times they stage these commercials in these kind of rugged mountain settings or something like that. And I'll always need to not watch. So that's something I struggle with, though, is like kind of knowing that I should get over that. I should work through that. And I don't want to have this kind of post-traumatic response to the sight of mountains because they are beautiful. And my now husband, Brodie, really loves the mountains and loves snowboarding. But for now, I kind of just keep avoiding it.
Do you get worried about him going up mountains, or is that something that you kind of can separate out?
Oh, I worry very much. I worry very much. And I don't want him not to do the things he loves because I have, a bad experience with it. And I try to be rational about it. But of course, it's very natural. So we've gotten good about him communicating because I will start panicking if he says he's going to be done his ski runs at this time and he doesn't call by that time. I will start to panic. I'll always ask him, are you wearing an avalanche beacon? Are you doing anything crazy? Like he's done heli-skiing before out of a helicopter and those kind of things. And I've asked him to maybe not go quite so extreme.
Gosh, I mean, to find someone who jumps out of helicopters to do skiing.
Oh yeah, no, I've had many conversations like, why can't you just golf? Or something
swim.
With tennis, really, nothing. Tennis is a wonderful game. And who doesn't love to read a book? Yeah, no, unfortunately, he's very into mountain biking and skiing, but that's something that I just try to kind of talk myself down from panic mode into realistic mode.
A big part of the story and a really unusual part of the story is that Eric's body was never found. Was there a short period of time, after the accident had happened before that was confirmed that would be the case? Or was there many days and weeks of wondering and waiting and, did that rescue operation continue for quite some time?
Yeah, the recovery mission, once it had been changed from rescue to recovery mission, did continue for several weeks, actually, beyond that, just because there was a large debris field that from helicopters, they were able to see just scattering of equipment, gear, clothing. I mean, just very much physical evidence of what happened. And so they had to figure out a way to get people kind of on the ground to do that, which is very complicated. And I think people had to rappel out of helicopters. I don't even know that they could hike in. And frankly, the reason I don't know that is because it was too hard for me to ever even read the final report that the Park Service commissioned and published about the accident. I knew everything I needed to know, which is that he was dead. But they did do a recovery mission. It was very complicated, and they did incredible work, very sensitive and thoughtful, difficult work. And they recovered 3 bodies. At that point, they were being identified by dental records and so on, because I think, and I'm sorry, I don't even know the exact time frame, but I think it must have been months actually that the recovery mission went on before they finally called it. So eventually they said, we can't find, it could be under piles of rocks. They don't know. But in any event, there were 3 bodies that they just could not find and could not recover. And his was one of them.
Is that like a sort of a second stage of grief? Because obviously there are some that are found. So at that point, somebody's getting some sort of closure on that in some way. What did that feel like?
Very strange. So finding out someone is dead and an immediate family member has died when there is no body falls into a category of loss called ambiguous loss. And I'm not really sure where that term comes from, but ambiguous loss kind of represents a category of grief and loss where intellectually that the person is gone, but you lack the typical physical evidence of that. And almost kind of the difference between physical evidence in a crime or circumstantial evidence of a crime. Physical evidence being, I saw someone get shot. Circumstantial evidence being, I saw a smoking gun on a table. You can piece things together intellectually, but you didn't actually see it. And that makes things very complicated. On top of another existing layer of complication, which is that sudden death is also very, very hard sometimes to come to terms with. Because when sudden is just suddenly gone, it makes sometimes less sense to us because we haven't prepared or processed sometimes that if someone is sick, you're able to kind of understand that differently. And so I kind of had this dual thing happening, which was coming to terms with sudden loss, which was just very surreal because, and I think this is very common with people whose people die suddenly, which is, but they can't be dead because they're coming home with milk later. And they can't be dead because I just saw them an hour ago and his towel is still on the towel rack. And there's just so much evidence of life that it's very hard to understand how that could suddenly cease so quickly. And as for not having a body, I think it really lent itself toward, at first, a very significant amount of magical thinking and bargaining. Well, he's not dead. They just think he is. But he's probably just digging his way out of the snow. And he's going to walk down the mountain. And he's going to be fine. And they'll probably make a movie about him. And, and I remember thinking for a while that would be what would happen. I think the most famous, if that's the right word, example of ambiguous loss like this would have been the 9/11 victims, how so many of those bodies weren't recovered. But it does happen, not often, but not rarely either.
I did an episode recently with someone called Mary Frances O'Connor, who's a neuroscientist, and she was talking about the grieving brain, and she talked about attachment theories and how exactly what you just said, we attach to people and the assumption is that you'll see them again, they'll come home from work, you're united as a family unit. But when someone dies and they're not there anymore, the brain is capable of literally running those 2 trains of thoughts at the same time. He's going to come home, but I know he's died. It's weird how you have the 2 running, and very clever, really, but that's where that confusion comes from. There's that reality of, well, he's going to come back because that's what he always does, and then trying to tell yourself that he won't. It must be a horrible parallel to live in. What happens when you get to the end of that track of he's not coming home? Is there a point when you realise this is it?
I think that going through the motions of him not coming home happened before my brain caught up with that. So I did all of the things, like there was a memorial service. I wore a black dress. I knew, so there wasn't really anything physical of him. Sorry. It's funny, sometimes I can just talk about this stuff kind of on autopilot, and sometimes I feel it very deeply. When he died, and I knew I wasn't going to have anything of him again. I just remembered thinking, I wonder if there's anything. So I just remember I was like, almost like I did this kind of forensic thing where I would just, I peeled back the sheets on our bed, and I was plucking hair off his pillowcase and off his bath towel. And I just, because that's all I had of him physically. And I just put like these, it's probably like 2 chest hairs and 5 head hairs, whatever the final count was, like that. And I just put it in a little envelope, and I wrote Eric on it. And I put it in my jewelry box, and it's still there. But I did things like that, and I gave away some of his clothes, and I kept some of his clothes. So I think several years later, I'm okay talking about it, but I never told anyone, I don't think, that I did things like, for example, like I kept his expired yogurt in the refrigerator for months, things like that. Or before I decided, okay, I need to empty his sports drinks and things out of the pantry, I photographed it all in the exact position that it was and that he left it, just because I kind of wanted to preserve things in that way. So I think a lot of us probably have these private rituals and these private gestures that we do for ourselves and maybe for the other person. I would continue to write him cards, and sometimes still do write him cards for significant dates. And I don't have a place to take them, but it means something to write them, I think. It was very much like almost like I needed to, at least on the inside, keep holding that torch for him to not be dead, even as I did all of the things that intellectually, like I said, showed that I knew that he was.
What did you do at the memorial then? How does it work practically when you haven't actually got a body to bury or cremate? Is there ways of doing that sort of help?
I mean, we all assembled at a country club, his grandparents' country club. Everyone was there, and we had speakers and a beautiful slideshow of photographs and, snacks afterward. And then we all just kind of went home. And that was it. It was done. But it was the closest thing I guess we could do. That was, similar-ish to a funeral.
That must be very hard to get closure on something like that. Or did you feel like that was the same sort of closure?
No, it was not. Again, and I think I'll never really know what part of this was because of the sudden death and what part of this is because there was no physical body to see or tangibly go through so many of the rituals that we as a human species have had for millennia, burials and so on. So I don't know what part of it is the suddenness and what part of it is the lack of a body, but it was not closure. It was a very emotionally fraught element of the process, I think. And then the day after the memorial service was the day after the memorial service, but in no way was it kind of phase 2 of what was going on, I think. It was nice to get over that hump because it was like this kind of like big looming thing. And I think when you're grieving, it's very hard to do anything, let alone a memorial service. But I just kind of felt, if anything, I think that a memorial service almost is a better signal or a better closure for people who were less close, because then it's kind of like, okay, we did the memorial service, that's done, we resume our lives. But for me, my new life was just starting. It was in some ways day one of my new life. So it didn't feel like closure, I don't think.
What do you think the main difference is with grieving somebody and having the body, and then grieving the loss of someone and not having the body?
Ritual. And I think that there are so many ways that we honor and celebrate and bury someone who has died. But again, like for millennia, there has been some ritual surrounding death. I mean, even elephants will have, funerals. And there is something there. And I don't know whether it's just on this kind of atavistic level or whatever, but we have developed this process where we kind of physically observe and to some extent engage with, I would say, the body of someone who has died, whether it's a viewing or a burial or a cremation or any number of things that we do in different cultures. And it feels undone in a way to not have a body. It's more difficult to accept loss, I think.
Just listening to you talking through some of those elements, I'm wondering if there was expert help or help from those around you, or suggestions of how to do things a little bit differently because you didn't have Eric's body, or was it just purely you doing things that you felt were right for you to do without anybody else's input?
The latter. I did go to grief counseling. I actually had 2 grief counselors over time, and I think I just kind of did normal grief counseling, and I don't think that attention was specifically paid to really drilling down on the fact that my process was perhaps different. And I say that acknowledging that everyone's grieving process is very unique and very personal and very much their own. But I don't even know that many experts have a playbook for sudden loss without a body, because it's not as common. The things that I did were just kind of organic in nature, just kind of intuitively thinking about what do I need, what feels right. So to that end, and I certainly made some mistakes along the way, as we all do when we're grieving, because we don't know what we're doing. We're just trying to get through it, I think, as best we can, fumble around. But I've been back to Mount Rainier once. It was terrible. I have not been back since. That was the first year. I had a bench made. When we were living in Brooklyn, there's a beautiful park called Prospect Park, and we would always take walks in Prospect Park. And so I had a bench made and dedicated for him there. So when I am in New York, I will go and I'll sit on his bench and I'll pat his plaque and just kind of sit there. And I suppose that's the closest thing I have in New York to a grave to visit. In DC, it's harder. I don't have a specific place, but I even find, and this is just for me, I find that sometimes even just walking through a cemetery is kind of grounding, and just being in a space with and it sounds so morbid as I say it. I'm like, being in a place with other dead people. So like, I don't mean it in like a morbid, creepy way, but it's the thing I've had to do was get as close-ish to the idea of a burial of some kind as I can without actually being able to do that.
Was there any value shared within sort of the wider community because of the fact a group was involved in this tragedy? Did you grow any friendships or develop any bonds with families also going through the same thing or similar to you?
Yeah, for a while all of the climbers had partners. So for a while, we all kept in touch and then drifted, except I actually am good friends now with one of the other spouses of one of the climbers because we both ended up moving to Washington, D.C. completely separately, but we became friends. And, we hang out now and don't talk about that, but occasionally we do. But it's nice to know that she went through the same thing, and I think we get it in a kind of unspoken way that we don't always need to talk about, but it's nice to know that someone gets it. And I think a lot of times in grief, and I say this as more of a universal thing for me, I have found that so often in grief, you just kind of want someone to get it with you, not fix it for you. And so it's nice to when people kind of just get it. I think that being a young widow was a very salient part of this for me because I don't think that we typically think of widowed people as being less than 65 or 70 years old, but it does happen. And so that has been very unique. And there's a lot of issues associated with that, like guilt in moving on. How are people going to judge you for dating again? Can you even do that? Is your person you're dating, your new partner, going to be jealous if you mention your old partner, or feel a sense of kind of internal competition with that person? It's very complicated. So it's been nice having other people who lost their partners young to just kind of talk about those issues with.
How have other people been? Because a lot of the people we speak to have mentioned that it's been sort of awkward with other people. Either other people don't know what to say or they say the wrong thing. And that seems to especially happen when you've got an area that maybe people don't know how to touch on, like his body was never found. I can imagine that would be something people are just like, I don't know how to approach this. Were other people generally quite good with you when you're going through your grief, or were there points where they made it harder in any way?
Yeah, well, I mean, people will always say dumb things. And the thing that I always try to remember is they all mean well. They truly do. So when someone says the wrong thing, I never really took offense to it because it was coming from a good and heartfelt place. And I just was so appreciative of that. I think that the other thing I tried never to do was judge people for or get angry or resentful at people for kind of not forgetting about me, but maybe not checking in as often as I needed them to. And the reason that I kind of didn't blame them is because they had no idea, because they hadn't gone through it. And thank God for that. So I don't think that people really understood how long and deep of a process that is, both to mourn the loss of the person, but also try to build a life from that rubble. And it's just really hard work and it's really long work. And I think I didn't always vocalize that because I didn't want to burden people with that and or be like the drag, So it's very complicated. And I have a couple friends who would continue to ask, continue to check in, but some who just kind of didn't. And, again, not blaming them, but I really appreciated the ones who did keep doing it.
Are there specific things you wished people had done more or that they did do and you really appreciated?
Yeah, I wish people would just, recognize that, especially if you've lost a partner and you're suddenly at home alone and living alone, maybe for the first time in years, that even coming over for a, not very good weeknight dinner in your chaotic home with the kids running around is amazing because you don't have to be by yourself. So I think it's nice. And I think it's very nice for people to bring food, but it's also very nice to have an invitation to go have food with someone because it is a very alone time, a very lonely time. So even don't think you have to do some impressive, elaborate, special Sunday meal. Just any chance, I think, to get out of the house, be among people, and feel a little bit normal is just so appreciated, I think. The other thing is just check in. I think sometimes people are afraid to mention the person that you lost because they don't want to upset you. But the thing I think it's very important to remember is that that person is already on your mind. So it's not like you're going to be reminding them. You're there, it's already there. So just maybe checking in, be like, I'm thinking of you today. I was thinking of you and the person you lost today. That's very meaningful. So don't think you're like awakening a memory that has been dormant. You're not.
I was wondering what you would say about Mount Rainier itself, because I didn't know, when sort of thinking about this beforehand, whether you would feel like it was sort of where part of him was, and whether you felt closer to him there in some way, or whether, like you said, it would be somewhere that you found really difficult to go and be near. Did you ever have that conflict going on?
Yeah, and I think that's actually an extremely insightful question. I've thought about that a lot. And the way I feel about Mount Rainier is that it's both his grave and a monument, but it's also his murderer. And so I have very mixed emotions about that mountain. I think that's why I've only been back once. Technically speaking, it would be the place to go to be the most physically proximate to him. It is his grave in a way. That's where he is. But I also hate that mountain. I hate its coldness in every sense of the word. I hate that it killed him. Of all days, of all years, of all climbs, there's so many climbers who do that route. Why him? Why this time? All of that. So I cannot reconcile those two things in my mind. So it's very complicated. But as to the why him, why me, one of the most blunt and helpful things someone said to me was, why not him? Why not you? And I thought that sounded extremely rude at first and insensitive at first, but the more I thought about it, it was incredibly helpful because it just kind of it helped show kind of the randomness of the universe, and it's just true. We live on a messy planet with weather and violence and all kind of complications, and sometimes things just happen.
You beat me to my question. Did you ever struggle with the why question? How long did it take you to get from that point of why him, why me, to then actually maybe accepting the why not me, why not him?
It took me until someone said that to me, and I had to kind of work through that a little bit. But I think that one thing that kind of went along with that is I would almost call it jealousy at other people. Like, I remember being at his memorial service and looking around and seeing other people with their spouses and just kind of leaning into their spouses for support, and then getting into their cars with their spouses to drive home together. And I just remember being like very angry and very jealous. Why do you get to do this? Why don't I have it, someone, And I just remember thinking how much I wanted Eric to be there to support me in my memorial service for him. It made no sense, but it was just, but like, what about this kind of thing does, Just, I think tied with the jealousy was anger. And then I really had to work on acceptance, both that it happened and that it's okay that other people don't have to go through this. But it's hard. It's hard. And it's not logical.
As part of the acceptance element, is there any chance at all that you could get a call one day from someone to say, we've found Eric's body, we've found remains?
That question does haunt me a little bit. I try not to think about it because I have worked very hard to find peace in this situation as it is. The line that I just have kind of told myself is that he is at peace on a mountain. He loved mountains. He died doing what he loved, and that made him feel like his best, most fulfilled self, and that he is at a beautiful place. Even though I hate it, it's a beautiful, beautiful place that he loved. And I think there's a certain peace that I have found in that for him. I am haunted by the fact that I don't know if one day I will look down at my phone and there's the Seattle, Washington area code, and it's going to be someone saying, guess what? Some new thing happened and we see some new debris. And at this point, I don't want that to happen. Personally, my feeling, I don't want that. I've found that I've made peace with that. And I feel like that would just, I think any physical disturbing of that earth would be also a very metaphorical disturbing of that earth. I do think that there would be something very traumatic, honestly, about getting a call and just kind of digging that up again and going through that identification process. And just, I think it would reopen the deepest wound I have. And, the wound is always there, but I think you form your scar over it. And I do feel like there would be some amount of ripping open the scar if that were to happen. But at the same time, I guess I have to try to, find some kind of Zen sense that, whatever will happen, and just going with it. But from a purely selfish and personal perspective, it's funny because I have kind of shifted from wanting him, and on some sense still regretting that I don't have him physically, to kind of mourn in a traditional way, but also not necessarily feeling like I need to drag that wish out my whole life.
It's interesting because if you hear those sorts of stories, and I can imagine the media especially might hear that, like, oh, they've found some remains from this accident that happened however many years ago. It's almost like it's good news in some way. Like, oh, finally we've found. But when you listen to your story and how much it takes to get beyond some of the processing of the fact that they weren't found, you can see actually how it would be a lot more painful and disturbing, like you said, than actually a good thing in any sense of the word. If someone else is facing this, more recently, let's say, and they've lost their person and there isn't anybody to do anything with, is there anything in particular that really helped you, or any kind of thought process that helped you along the way?
Yeah, I think, let yourself go through the motions, even if, what is that expression? Fake it till you make it. I think sometimes just go through the motions anyway, even if you don't quite believe them yet, because I think that the rituals surrounding death do matter and they do accomplish something. Other than that, it was very helpful for me to read about ambiguous loss and read some writings on people who have worked with 9/11 victim families and so on, because to me, there was a lot just to feeling like someone was putting words to my swirling brain, that could barely process anything. And that was very helpful to understand that this actually, these kind of diametrically opposed thoughts that I was having, I know he's dead, but he's going to come off the mountain, and like all these things was normal, and just believe in time, as annoying as that is for people to say. And I'm sorry I'm even saying it out loud, because no one wants to hear, give it time heals. It's one of those rote things, but I'm going to say it anyway. I'm sorry. It does help.
Yeah. And so with that in mind, whether it's a passage of time or something else, when do you think on reflection, you started to see the good again, you started to allow yourself to feel happy, to feel joy? What's that journey been like of actually finding the good in life?
I would say that I was first able to leave the house without a wad of tissues. It was probably 5 or 6 months. And then I think I remember measuring time mostly by incremental changes in time between crying. Did I go 2 hours without crying? Did I go a day without crying? Did I go, and that kind of thing. I feel like that's how I measured time at first. I think after about 6 months, I started to feel a little less like catatonic and exhausted, and just truly just bereft. But it took me 2 years, I would say, before I really felt like in any way myself again. I was also I think this is very common too, just had a lot of physical symptoms. I think grief is very physical process, and just felt sick a lot, weak a lot, had a lot of colds, things like that. So it really took me a couple of years before I really felt kind of like myself. And even then, you'll never be your old self again, but just kind of being able to say, "Oh, I know her," that kind of thing, and kind of go forward with my new me. It's about 2 years.
Listening to you talk, I think of our sort of heart for this podcast, exploring 101 different types of loss, shining light on the fact there's such a spectrum of loss, to see if hope and joy can exist in or through every type of loss. So when I use words like hope and joy, what does that make you feel or think about your own story and your own journey with hope and joy?
I think that one of the most important things to know is that it's okay to laugh. It's okay to be happy. Be grateful that you can laugh again and feel grateful again. And don't feel badly about that. You can miss your person and love your person and be loyal to your person. That doesn't equal sadness and grief and mourning. Both can exist. And so give yourself the grace of just being happy for yourself. If you could, not if, when you are happy again, you deserve it. That's what I think they want for you. And I still remember the first time I had like a big laugh after Eric died, and it just felt so good and a little foreign, but so good. And then I think it gets more and more frequent, and that's all to the good.
I'm thinking as you're talking about Brodie, your husband now, and him listening to this, what has it been like working through your story with Brodie and sharing this with him?
I think especially in a young widow situation, it's important to talk about like kind of the permission to move forward and to have a new partner, because I think there's a lot of guilt that can go along with that, and a lot of struggle with people equating it almost with like, I don't know, divorce or something like that, which it's not. But Brodie, he lost his wife. So we're both widowed. So that has kind of been unique for us. And I think that the most important thing for people who are widowed and date again, do not put pressure on yourself to date before you're ready. Do not put pressure on yourself to wait either. If you're ready, you're ready. There's no right time to do that except for what feels right to you. So don't try to meet the expectations of others or some expectation you want to have on yourself. You're entitled to partnership. You're entitled to love. You're entitled to happiness. Maybe be careful about dating someone who doesn't allow you to have space for the person you lost. That person needs to understand that there's room for both.
When it came to think about dating again, was that something where you thought, I might try dating again? Or was it that you met somebody and those feelings sort of developed and you thought, oh, maybe I'd be open to dating again?
I thought that was it for me. I thought that, well, at least I had love once. At least I got to say that I was in love and was married. And I believed to the core of my being that was it. And be grateful that you had that. And maybe one day in, I don't know, 20 or 25 years, I'd meet a nice man who would sometimes want to just go to a movie with me, or we would maybe play chess in a park together. I don't know. Like, it's like I suddenly aged myself to be like 70 years old or something. I don't know. But I just kind of had this idea that that was it for me. You know, that's all. Just accept that. So I was not planning in any way to date again. It just kind of happened, I would say, in a very Dickensian best of times, worst of times situation, because we just connected, and it was wonderful because we did have this bond, both in losing our spouses at pretty much exactly the same time, but we also had a lot in common besides that. And but it was also the worst of times because this was no time to be I think starting a new relationship before you really grieved your lost one. But sometimes life just happens to you when it happens. And for good or bad, life doesn't always follow your schedule. So I think we just kind of navigated that in our own time. And we're just very communicative about it, about, what we felt ready for, didn't feel ready for. And we also didn't tell people at first that we were dating, just because it was important for us to just kind of maintain a bubble of, just kind of protect ourselves in a way and not feel like we had to worry about other people's judgment. Because I think people will judge. I don't think that's an uncommon thing. And we just kind of didn't feel like we owed that to anyone.
Really liked what you said about just allowing each other space. You've got to have that space. I think with you both having the experience of being widowed, it reminds me of Claire and myself with our childlessness story, that yes, we have made a decision in agreement and have both got our piece with making that decision to carry on as a two, but we do intentionally check in with each other every, let's say 6 months. Are we still on the same page? Are we still okay with that? Has anything changed? Anything shifted? You made me wonder whether for you and Brodie as well, do you check in with each other in a similar way? Are we still okay? Anything to talk about?
Yeah, and I think especially on significant dates, his late wife's birthday, Eric's birthday, that kind of thing. We'll be very sensitive on those days to one another. And, I just think we're kind of open. If I'm feeling on a certain way on a certain day, I won't hide it. I'll just talk about it, and I think that's really important. That's why I said, make sure that you have a partner who, if cannot understand it from a personal perspective, can respect that you have gone through this and not judge it, and trust that a love for someone else doesn't negate the love for you.
Brilliant. We've reached the final question. Lisa, what's your Herman?
Well, one thing that I am going to, it's not mine, I heard it, I'm going to pass it along, was someone describing grief as the whole you live your life around. And I've always loved that image, because it's not saying you need to fill it in. It's not saying you need to cover it up. It's saying you can exist with the whole, but you will build a beautiful garden, a beautiful life around the whole. And I just think that's a lovely way to go forward. Give yourself permission to carry the loss, but also to build something very meaningful and beautiful around it.
So often you see grief depicted in diagrams as a circle that life is built around. But I love this idea of it being a whole. But not a hole that needs to be dealt with or filled in and covered, just one we learn to live around, acknowledging that sometimes it will feel more daunting or even take things away from us. But we are free to do what we want with it. Build a garden around it, acknowledge it, ignore it, the choice is ours. And eventually, hopefully, familiarity with it will grow, and it will become something we understand more and fear less.
As you could tell, we really enjoyed our time with Lisa and are so thankful for the conversation she allowed us to have with her.
And you can hear more from Lisa by checking out episode 59 of The Silent Why, where I spoke to her on the Let's Chat Food and Grief episode, where we explored the love that her and Eric shared for food and how our own relationship with food and meals can be impacted by grief. I'll put a link in the show notes.
We'll also add links to her website, lisakolbruland.com, where you can read more of her story and about her food and grief project, and also a 2015 Washington Post article that she wrote on how the second year of widowhood was actually harder.
And check out thesilentwhy.com or at thesilentwhypod on social media for more about us.
We're finishing with some excerpts from Pauline Boss's book, Ambiguous Loss, Learning to Live with Unresolved Grief.
Maintaining hope in the face of long-term ambiguity requires ceaseless effort, bringing to mind the story of Sisyphus. The gods condemned Sisyphus to an eternity of laboriously rolling a rock to the top of a mountain. When he finally reaches the top, the boulder rolls back down and Sisyphus has to start all over again. Such ceaseless labour is precisely what people with ambiguous loss face. Unlike Sisyphus, however, those suffering unresolved grief can still cling to hope. Many people succeed. Indeed, many in my research and clinical work are able to see some hope in their ambiguous loss. It is not the situation that changes, but what they hope for.